On a cold day in February 1531, a crowd gathered at Smithfield, London's notorious site of public execution. They were accustomed to the grim spectacles of hanging or burning at the stake. But on this day, they witnessed something new, something horrifying. In the center of the square, a massive iron cauldron, filled with water, was set over a roaring fire. As the water began to bubble and steam, a condemned prisoner named Richard Roose was brought forward. He was bound in chains, which were attached to a gibbet overhead. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the executioners used the pulley to slowly, deliberately, lower the terrified man into the boiling cauldron. His screams were said to be unimaginable as he was repeatedly raised and then plunged back down into the scalding water, his life ending in a prolonged and excruciating agony. To understand this uniquely cruel fate, we must travel back a few weeks earlier to the London home of one of England's most powerful and respected men, John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. Bishop Fisher was a man of deep piety and international renown, a bastion of the old Catholic faith. In his household, a terrible event had occurred. During a meal, a pot of porridge had been served to the bishop's family and a group of local poor who had come for charity. Suddenly, those who had eaten from the pot fell violently ill, struck down with convulsions and agonizing stomach pains. By the time the chaos subsided, 17 people were severely sick and to have died from the poison. An investigation was launched immediately, and suspicion quickly fell upon one man, the household cook, Richard Roose. This was a shocking crime, a deadly betrayal committed within the sanctuary of a great man's home. Murder by a servant was a serious offense, but it was a crime with a standard. Well-established punishment in Tudor England, hanging by the neck until dead. But Richard Roose was not hanged. He was subjected to a terrifying and alien punishment, a fate seemingly drawn from a nightmare. Why? Why was the law not enough? Why was a common cook singled out for a death of such inventive cruelty? The answer lies not with the cook, nor even with his victims. The answer lies with the paranoid and all-powerful will of the man who sat on England's throne. To understand why Richard Roose was boiled alive, you have to understand the mind of the man who personally ordered his death, King Henry VIII. To understand the king's reaction, we must understand the crisis consuming his kingdom. By 1531, King Henry VIII was a man possessed by two all-consuming obsessions: his desperate need for a male heir and his passionate love for the captivating Anne Boleyn. His first wife, the devout and respected Catherine of Aragon, had failed to give him a son, providing only a daughter, Mary. Henry, a deeply religious man, became convinced this was God's punishment for marrying his brother's widow. He needed to annul the marriage, to set Catherine aside and take a new wife who could secure the Tudor dynasty. That new wife was to be Anne Boleyn, but Anne refused to be a royal mistress. She demanded to be queen. This was Henry's great matter. He petitioned the Pope in Rome for an annulment, but the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused. This refusal plunged England into a state of unprecedented crisis. The king was at war. With the Pope, the nobility was divided, and the entire religious and political foundation of the realm was threatening to crack. The court of Henry VIII became a viper's nest of intrigue, ambition, and a deep, simmering paranoia that started with the king himself. At the very center of the opposition to the king's great matters stood Bishop John Fisher. He was no minor cleric. Fisher was one of the most learned and revered churchmen in Europe, a cardinal of the Catholic Church, and a man of unshakable conviction. He was Queen Catherine's most steadfast and eloquent supporter, from the pulpit and in writing. He argued fiercely that her marriage to Henry was valid in the eyes of God, and that the king had no right to cast her aside. He openly challenged the king's will, citing scripture and canon law, and his reputation gave his arguments immense weight. To Henry, Fisher was more than an obstacle. He was a powerful and defiant symbol of the old order that stood in the way of his desires. He was the intellectual leader of the resistance. It was into this political powder keg that the news of the poisoning at Bishop Fisher's house landed like a lit match. In the hyper-suspicious atmosphere of Henry's court, this was not viewed as a simple domestic crime. It was a potential political assassination. The questions would have flown through the court. Who would want to kill Bishop Fisher? Was it a radical supporter of Anne Boleyn, trying to remove a major obstacle to her rise? Was it an agent of a foreign power, trying to destabilize England? Or was it something else entirely? For King Henry, a man famously terrified of plots, disease, and sudden death, the method was as terrifying as the act itself. Poison was seen as the weapon of cowards, spies, and assassins. It was an un-English, dishonorable way to kill, a threat that could bypass his guards and penetrate the very walls of his palaces. It was an attack on the social order and a direct threat to the safety of the kingdom as elite. Henry believed a crime so vile, so cowardly, and so threatening to his world demanded a new and spectacular form of justice. He would make an example of the poisoner, and the punishment would be a horror that England would never forget. The investigation into the poisoning was swift. The cook, Richard Roose, was arrested and brought in for questioning. Under interrogation, he quickly confessed. But his confession was a strange one. He admitted to putting a white powder into the porridge, but he swore he had no intention of killing anyone. He claimed the powder was a laxative, part of a cruel practical joke intended merely to make his fellow servants suffer a bout of digestive distress and public embarrassment. He was, he insisted, not a murderer, but a foolish prankster whose joke had gone horribly, tragically wrong. Was he telling the truth? Was he a simple-minded man who had made a terrible mistake? Or was he a calculating killer, lying to save his own neck? In the end, it made no difference. King Henry had taken a personal interest in the case, and he had already decided that Roose's crime demanded a punishment that would be remembered for centuries. Under normal circumstances, the case of a lowly cook would never have reached the king's ears, let alone the halls of Parliament. But Henry saw an opportunity. In the midst of his own political and religious crisis, surrounded by perceived enemies, he chose this moment to make a powerful statement. He personally went before the Lords and Commons of Parliament to address the crime. He argued that poisoning was not like other forms of murder. It was not a crime of passion, but a cowardly, secret act of malice that could strike down anyone. No matter how powerful, it was a uniquely insidious threat to the security of his nobles, his bishops, and the king himself. He declared that such a vile act was not merely murder, but a form of high treason, and that the existing punishment of hanging was wholly inadequate. A new kind of crime, he argued, required a new and terrifying kind of punishment: Parliament. By this stage of Henry's reign, was largely a rubber stamp for the king's will. They quickly and dutifully drafted the legislation he demanded. The result was the 1531 Act for the poisoning, one of the most specific and brutal laws in English history. The act began by condemning the use of poison as an abominable crime, hated by God. It then formally reclassified willful murder by poison as high treason. And then came the key provision, the one specifically designed for Richard Roose. The law declared that the mandatory punishment for this new form of treason was to be execution by being boiled to death. To ensure their target could not escape this fate, Parliament made the law retroactive, meaning it applied to crimes committed before the law itself was passed. It was an astonishing act of legal manipulation. The king had not just enforced the law, he had invented a law, complete with a horrific new form of death, and applied it backwards in time to condemn one specific man. The stage was now set for the terrible spectacle at Smithfield. With the law in place, the final act of Richard Roose's life could begin. His execution was to be a major public event, a piece of political theater directed by the king himself. On that cold April morning, Roose was dragged from his prison cell and taken on a grim procession through the streets of London to the execution ground at Smithfield. Crowds of Londoners lined the route, a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. They knew this was to be no ordinary hanging. They were there to witness something new, something sanctioned by the highest powers in the land. A punishment designed to be so terrible it would be spoken of for generations. The state didn't just want to kill Richard Roose, it wanted to make an unforgettable example of him. At Smithfield, the horrifying apparatus was waiting. A massive iron cauldron, large enough to hold a man, was suspended over a roaring fire, its contents bubbling and steaming in the cold air. Above it stood a gibbet, fitted with a chain and pulley. After his sentence was read aloud, Richard Roose was bound in the chains. Then, the slow, agonizing process began. He was not thrown into the cauldron. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, the executioners used the pulley to lower him into the boiling water feet first. A contemporary chronicle describes how Roose roared, crying and piteously shrieking. He was then hoisted up, gasping in the air, only to be plunged back down again. This horrific process was repeated, a tortuous cycle of immersion and agony. For what may have been as long as 2 hours, he was raised and lowered, boiled alive in stages, until at last his body gave out and he was dead. The crowd, many of whom were accustomed to the brutal realities of Tudor justice, had never seen anything like it. This spectacle of suffering was meticulously designed to send a series of powerful messages from the king to his subjects. First, to any who would consider using poison, the message was clear. If you choose a secret, cowardly weapon, you will suffer a public, agonizing, and prolonged death. The punishment was crafted to be the terrifying antithesis of the crime. Second, To the common people, it was a visceral demonstration of the king's absolute power. It showed that Henry was a ruler unconstrained by tradition, a king who could invent new and terrible ways to enforce his will. It was a warning that the law was whatever he said it was, and his wrath was boundless. But perhaps the most important message was for the nobility, for men like Bishop John Fisher and any others who dared to defy the king's will. In his great matter, the retroactive nature of the law and the sheer brutality of the punishment showed that no one was beyond the king's reach. If Henry could invent a law and a gruesome death for a lowly cook, he could do the same for a bishop, a lord, or a duke. He was demonstrating that the old rules no longer applied. In the New England that Henry was forging, there was only one power that mattered, and it was his. The screams of Richard Roose at Smithfield were meant to echo in the halls of Parliament and the palaces of the powerful. It was the sound of King Henry VIII announcing his absolute and terrifying authority to the world. The terrifying law that condemned Richard Roose to the cauldron, the act of poisoning, did not last. It was a law born of a specific moment and a specific king's paranoia. Shortly after Henry VIII's death, during the reign of his son, Edward VI, the act was quietly repealed, and the punishment of boiling to death was struck from the statute books forever. It was seen, even by the standards of the time, as too extreme, too closely associated with the personal tyrannies of the old king. But Richard Roose was not its only victim. In 1542, a young servant girl named Margaret Davy was also convicted of poisoning her mistress. She, too, was taken to a public square and boiled alive, a final, horrifying application of Henry's most brutal law. The act's short life proves that it was never about establishing a lasting legal principle. It was about providing the king with a personal instrument of terror to be used as he saw fit. And what of the man whose household was the catalyst for this entire affair? Bishop John Fisher survived the poison plot of 1531, but he could not survive the king's great matter, his steadfast refusal to accept Henry's supremacy over the Church of England marked him for death. In 1535, for years after his cook was boiled alive, the elderly and frail Bishop Fisher was declared a traitor. He was taken from his prison cell, the Tower of London, to the scaffold on Tower Hill, where he was publicly beheaded. The irony is staggering. Fisher had escaped a secret death by poison, only to suffer a public death by the axe. It proves that the king's wrath was inescapable. Whether by inventing a new law for a lowly cook, or by enforcing an old one against a prince of the church, Henry VIII would use any means necessary to destroy those who stood in his way. In the grand, dramatic story of Henry VIII, with his 6 wives, his epic break with the Church of Rome, and his wars, the strange case of Richard Roose is often a mere footnote, but it is a uniquely revealing one. The story of the man who was boiled alive is a perfect microcosm of Henry's reign. It reveals his deep-seated paranoia, his obsession with absolute control, his shocking willingness to bend and invent laws to serve his immediate needs, and his genius for using public, theatrical cruelty as a powerful tool of political communication. While we remember the king for the wives he divorced and beheaded, it is in the forgotten fate of a humble cook that we see the true nature of his power. personal, vindictive, and terrifyingly absolute. The story of Richard Roose shows how quickly law can be twisted into a tool of personal vengeance. What does this forgotten piece of history tell us about justice and tyranny? Join the discussion below and subscribe to ensure you never miss our next investigation into the darkness of the past.